A group of retired men would gather every day for breakfast and for solving all the world's problems. But on this one morning, it was the day after they had sadly said goodbye to John, one of their regulars who had died, and they had been at his funeral. And as they sat around nursing their coffee, they reflected all the good things that was said about John at his funeral. And then the topic began to shift, and they began to talk about what they wanted to hear at their funerals. What might be said of them. And one guy who's a retired physician said that he wanted to hear about all those babies that he had delivered who are now adults and living productive lives. And another, a lawyer, wanted to hear about his honesty and his hard work to protect those people who were often overlooked within the legal system. And a teacher wanted to hear from the students that he taught. A contractor said he wanted to hear about all those houses that people have loved living in that he had built. And they kind of went around the whole table, and everybody had chimed in except for Paul. And all eyes then turned toward Paul. And he knew he had to say something. So he just kind of shrugged his shoulders and he said, I want to hear someone say, look, he's moving. Now, if you caught the weird news of the week, you probably have heard about the woman in Nebraska. She had been pronounced dead. Her body was prepared to be sent to the funeral home. It was picked up by them, I'm assuming in a body bag, and taken to the funeral home, where, to the surprise of the undertaker, she was still breathing. Now, our text today contains two miracles. One involves a healing, the other the raising of the dead. The latter, I suggest, is a little different than misdiagnosing death, as happened in Nebraska. Now, while our Christian hope is in life everlasting, we live out our faith in this life and in these bodies. Even the story of the raising of the dead that's found in this text really has more to do for the concern of the girl's grieving parents than for the life of one restored. Those guys sitting around the table at breakfast sharing what they wanted to hear in some ways gets it right. What kind of influence have we had in our lives on the world in which we live? Now, we've already had a couple of examples of one of Mark's favorite literary techniques, that is the sandwich. This is where Jesus starts out on one topic or on one project, and he then kind of goes off tangent and then returns back to the main theme. This happens in our story today. We have a grieving father whose 12-year-old is dying. And then we have an older woman who, ironically, has also been ill for 12 years. And Jesus cares for both. The story can also be found in the other two synoptic Gospels, that is in Matthew and in Luke. These final miracle stories conclude a set of three miracle stories, which began with the calming of the water we looked at 3 weeks ago, followed by the healing of the demoniac, and now this story. And in a way, chapter 5 of Mark's Gospel is focusing on those who are ritually unclean. people that are desperate in this world in which they live. One commentator even suggested chapter 5 of Mark should be titled the St. Jude chapter, referring to the fact that Jude is often seen as the saint for lost causes. Now, all three of the miracles in chapter 5 required Jesus to ignore Jewish restrictions. He encounters both the man of the tombs, which made him unclean, as well as the deceased girl and the woman with kind of an ongoing ministration. Jesus, who continually places people over the rules, immediately acts to relieve the suffering of others. One more interesting tidbit about our text this morning comes at the end. When Jesus awakes the girl who was dead, we're given the words Jesus used in Aramaic, kind of a later version of Hebrew. And then we're also given a translation, which in the original was in Greek. So you have this Aramaic word and then the Greek word. Now, in most English translations, the Aramaic word remains, but the Greek word is translated, little girl, get up, or something like that. It seems odd to have the original language along with an original translation here, since Hebrew or Aramaic speakers, which would mostly be the Jews of the day, would not need a translation to know what Jesus meant, which has led some scholars to suggest that this is one of the places that they suggest that Mark is not writing for a strictly Jewish audience, but perhaps an audience that is more Gentile. So let's look at our text. I'll be reading from the second half of the 5th chapter of Mark, beginning with the 21st verse. So here's God's word. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came to him. When he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhaging stopped, and she felt in her body that she had been healed of her disease. Immediately where the power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you? How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in to where the child was. And he took her by the hand and he said, "Talitha, come," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. This is the word of the Lord. One of the interesting things about this text is that except for the girl's father, the central characters involve women. Now, in the Old Testament, we have healing stories of those who had been ill and had been ritually unclean, and they are healed. And we also have a few stories of those who had been dead being restored to life. But they are all men. In the Roman world, women had little status. It was even common for infant girls to be abandoned, kind of like the female infants in China during their one child per couple only era, when such practice would have been considered an abomination among the Jews. For Gentiles, it was less so. One of the ways the early church set itself apart from the pagan world was to adopt and to care for those who had been abandoned. In his ministry, Jesus shows the value of everyone. Now, Jesus is back on the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee. Unlike the other side, as we saw last week, where people wanted him gone out of fear, here he's welcomed back by a large crowd on his home turf. And again, as happened throughout his Galilee ministry, a crowd swarms around Jesus. And we're told that amidst this crowd, there's a leader of the synagogue. Now, that doesn't mean that he was a rabbi. He was probably not. He was probably a local lay leader of the synagogue, one who would take care of kind of the business end of the enterprise. But it's also an indication that he's someone of status, because the rest of the synagogue would have placed him into this position of trust and authority. He's obviously also one who believes that Jesus has special powers. For his daughter is ill, and he comes to Jesus instead of going out to some physician for help. He believes that Jesus' touch is all it's going to take to make his daughter well. But don't forget, while he's trying to pull Jesus away, there's this crowd that's pressing in on him. So much so that we can imagine Jesus hardly being able to move. And while he tries to head off toward helping the girl, there's a woman in need who comes up from behind him and touches his robe. Now, from what it says here, we might assume that she was one who had status, who had wealth. But she has spent the last 12 years spending all of her wealth in order to be made whole. But she continues to bleed. She spent everything on doctors and has been unable to find a cure. And so now she is broke. Now she's kind of a castaway from society, and Jesus is her only hope. And she believes that if she can just touch the seam of his robe, that she'll be saved. Now, this interruption here places some tension within the story. Because we're told the girl is at death's door. Jesus needs to come fast if he's going to be able to save her. And while the crowd has pushed in, Jesus realizes that some of his healing power has left him, so he stops and he asks, "Who touched me?" And for the disciples, this was an absurd question. Because everyone has been touching Jesus. They can't help it. It's like being on one of those crowded trains in Tokyo during rush hour, the ones where you got attendants there along the side of the track who kind of push people in so they can get the doors shut. But Jesus knows some of his powers has left. So he looks around. And the woman who had reached out to Jesus confesses that she is the one. And she is honest, but she's also afraid. For we're told she only confesses with fear and trembling as she kneels before Jesus. Jesus, using endearing words, say, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Be at peace and be healed," or "Go in peace and be healed." This interruption, though, has cost precious minutes. And now the father of the girl receives a word that she has died. And those who bring the word advise him not to bother Jesus anymore. After all, there's nothing more that can be done. It's time for the father and the rest of the family to begin their mourning. But Jesus encouraged faith, and that they continued to believe, and so Jesus heads off with this man and with his disciples to his home. And when we get there, the funeral home undoubtedly had already arrived, and they had begun to kind of arrange things. We can imagine neighbors and members of the synagogue hauling in food while there's another group crying out in grief. One thing about grief is that emotionally, when we are in grief, we our emotions shift fairly quickly back and forth. And I've known this all along, but I will have to say it became more evident at my dad's death. Because one minute we would find ourselves crying, and the next minute we would be laughing. So when Jesus asked about why is all this fuss going on, and suggests that this girl is fine, the gathered crowd, who had been crying out in grief, erupt in laughter. Because they've seen the dead. They know what the dead looks like. They know that the dead don't just get up and crawl out of a casket. Something that Jesus' ministry would later challenge. The wording here, though, does give us pause to ponder if she was really dead. Or perhaps she was like the woman in that Nebraska funeral home. Because Jesus says she's just asleep. But Mark is also making a point here that Jesus' power extends over death. So I take it that means that she is sleeping in the same way we will speak of someone going to their eternal rest. Or maybe, as one commentator suggests, when he says that she's just asleep, he's saying that she's not irrevocably dead. In other words, Jesus can still raise her. So taking only his top three disciples, Peter, James, and John, along with the parents, Jesus goes inside to where the girl lies. And here, with his words, which mean, "Little girl, get up," he takes her hand, and she rises, and she walks about. And then Jesus tells them not to tell anyone what happens, but there's always a practical side to Jesus. He instructs them to go get the girl something to eat. Now, Mark may have placed these miracle stories, the calming of the water, the healing of that crazy man, the healing of the woman, and the raising of the girl, back to point to Jesus' divinity. But we also learn something else from these stories, especially the ones that we looked at this morning. Jesus is concerned with individual lives. And his concern extends even to those sidelined within the Roman world. If Mark, as many suggest, wrote primarily to a Gentile audience, the idea that no one is excluded from Jesus' love is indeed good news. And it should be good news to us too. Amen.